So welcome to this summary of the results from the latest Global Capability for Change survey. As I said, I've sorted out the recording, but you're all on mute. The key thing is that what we're looking for is any questions. You can put those in the chat. Jill will be looking at the chat all of the time, and she will interrupt me at any point where she thinks it would be a good idea for me to answer that question. Or, of course, Jill's got all the data in front of her as well, so she might very well want to answer the question herself. But meanwhile, I'm going to lead you through some of the key stats. First of all, why we bother doing this, because a global survey is no small undertaking. And so some of the things we wanted to know off the back of the Capability for Change group that we run on a monthly basis was that, where are we in terms of the level of change that we're all experiencing? Can I just ask you, if you're not on mute already, if you could put yourselves on mute, because I can hear some of the feedback, so that will be helpful. What interests me is the comparison with last year, and the figures last year were horrendous for the volume of change, and they haven't really changed much. In that last year we basically said that as far as what's staying the same, it's almost the same as this year. 15% think that we'll have the same level of change as we have now. This year, we think we've got about 83% think that it's increasing. That was 89% last year. 11% thinking it was staying the same, and we had nobody saying that it was not going to increase. This year we've got 2% who are very optimistically saying no, it won't increase, it can't get any worse than it is. But there we go. We'll have to see. We're also looking at, we want to know what's driving the change, and there are a lot of questions that we're trying to answer about, are we a valued service, and are we something that the business really respects? So we're going to have a little look and see if we can get some answers for you. Some of the things that caught my attention here is, why is it that we are trying to increase the capability for change? What is the perception of change, the value of change management? And the top one here is accelerating the realization of benefits towards the bottom. And then we have the ability to manage in changing internal priorities. Now, what catches my attention about that is that it's almost double the score for better respond to volatile market conditions. In other words, it's telling me that there is an internal sort of focus in terms of what we're dealing with in terms of change. We're not thinking, well, actually, there is a lot of external factors that are affecting us, but actually we're trying to think about all of our internal priorities and how they are going. So it's not an outward and maybe a proactive look. It's actually, can we deal with the changes that we've decided on internally? Can we cope with those? The thing that really caught my attention, though, this year is the reduced silo-based working, sort of second from the top there, because that certainly accords with some of the feedback that we're getting anecdotally. I mean, I just have to remember how many people I talk to in workshops and in training courses throughout the year. And I think the opaqueness that we suffer from in a more hybrid world, and a hybrid world has become the norm, whether CEOs and senior leaders like it or not, and it tends to be in the CEO surveys that they don't, but whether they like it or not, certainly the feedback from the global HR surveys around the world is that hybrid working is now the new norm. There was a big event for global HR leaders in Arizona about a month ago, and where they were looking at the data from 2019 and then looking at the data now. And basically, a quick summary is that the average working from home across the world was half a day per week in 2019. It's now 2.5 days per week. So it's half and half. That's the average. Some people do more, some people do less, but the average is 2.5 days. In other words, not going into the office is now the norm, certainly for part of the week. And I think what we're seeing is, if I'm going to work in a more hybrid way, I'm much more connected to the people that I'm directly in a team with, and I am going to find it much harder to understand who other people are in my organization and to create relationships with them. not because people are inherently antisocial, but simply because there isn't enough time to come on calls with the people that we're working with, let alone take the time out to try to build relationships outside of that direct need. So I think reducing silo-based working, it's because silo-based working is becoming a growing threat. And therefore, there are a lot of changes which are about how do we encourage transparency? How do we encourage cross-functional working? So I'm not surprised to see that as high as it actually is, because I think the anecdotal evidence bears that out. When it comes to the types of change that we're getting involved in, actually, we've got a bearing on what we had last year, which is down the bottom, increasing digitisation, and then the third from the bottom, increasing operational efficiencies, are still absolutely the highest. And that is not a surprise. There was a lot of discussion last year when we did the survey about, well, surely increasing digitisation is for operational efficiency, when others made the case, well, no, it's about innovation and doing things that we weren't able to do before. But either way, those are the two sort of leaders. But what I think something we ought to look at the other end of the scale is that there isn't anything on supply chain. And we commented on that last year, in that we felt that with the Ukrainian war and other geopolitical risks, we probably felt that addressing supply chain issues was going to be a source of change, and it hasn't panned out that way. It wasn't the case last year, and it isn't the case this year. But one that is much higher this year is reorganisation. And certainly, again, from the anecdotal evidence we have, there is, I think, this push more towards, we want greater efficiencies. We are reorganizing for those greater efficiencies. We've now got this, we know what we are post-COVID, we're stable. We're now reorganizing to get the most out of the resources that we've got. We put an extra question in this time. We don't choose to do that a lot because we're obviously looking at like for like every year, but we did put in adopting artificial intelligence and to see how popular that was. And of course, that's about the fourth most popular. So that's an interesting one. And I'm sure when we keep that in for next year, we'll see that growing. But it gives us a flavour of the kinds of changes we are all doing. In terms of, this is truly a global survey, I suppose this one I'm the most proud of, because it's never easy to get people to complete a survey. The feedback I've had this year is that the survey is incredibly valuable. We've had a third more people answer it than we had last year. But I also had a lot of feedback from people who say, oh yeah, I'll get around to it, I'll get around to it. I'm just so busy. I'm just so busy. And knowing that it's only 15 minutes long, it also bears out my own experience, which is that to set aside some time to actually think ahead and away from what's actually on our desks, because this is what this does, is it gives us a chance to sort of benchmark our own understanding. Well, struggling to have that personal investment in our own profession and what we're doing, I think indicates that, again, far too many of us are far too busy. There are a few things, because it's not just people answering the survey. I have a lot of discussions with people around the world as they're answering the survey, and there are a few things that I thought I'd pick out. Number one, this year I was really very aware of how many more change roles actually are based in India than were the year before. It was so significant that it really caught my attention. Whereas the year before, when I was talking to various firms, we don't have a change team in India. No. We use India for our outsourced processing, but we don't use them for anything strategic. No, if we're going to do change to anybody, we will fly over there and do it ourselves. And actually, in only a year, we're starting to see a very big difference there. I work a lot in the Middle East, and it doesn't surprise me that there is so much change. I think what happens is that it's fairly normal to have both project and change teams being respected as two different professions. Actually seeing that reflected, there were so many people who answered from the Middle East this year that actually we were able to catch them as their own zone, which we weren't last year. Similarly, we have the same issue in South America, because again, there was an increase in the focus on change roles across that continent. So it's interesting to see that there's growth there. one of the things we see is North America and Canada were rolled together because the responses from Canada were there were fewer this year than there had been in the previous year. I think it's because I just didn't do some of the I didn't do any marketing in North America or Canada. I have to be honest about the survey. If you were with me last year, you might remember this, but if you're new to this survey, it will give you a good guide. We ask you two types of questions, one of which is for you to think through, almost on an evidence basis. Have we got a process for that? Have we got a template for that? Have we got somebody responsible for that? If the answer, as you quickly try to answer the question, your brain is sort of going through the evidence and going, yeah, I think we have, then you're going to score more highly on the think. You're going to go, yes, I'm feeling positive about that. We also ask different questions at different times because we mix them all up. And those questions are angled much more towards how do you feel though? Are you seeing the results? Are you seeing that that's happening? Do you feel that progress is being made? So we get two different scores when we're looking at any of our questions because we bring those together. Now, what's interesting is that when you have the think and the feel scores closely aligned, it means that there is really a pretty true picture. What you think, the evidence-based answer, and what you feel aligned. So, you know, whatever that score is, you can look and say, well, is that high enough? And if not, take action. If you find that the feel score is so much higher than the think score, then there is clearly a warning sign. There is cognitive dissonance between the two. There's something out of alignment. And you've got a sense that something is happening, but perhaps it's not being reflected in the processes that you're running and what you're actually making happen. Equally, if your think score is higher than your feel score, then maybe you have got the processes in place, but you don't feel that you're getting the results you would like. You don't feel that they're working. So we have to keep an eye out, and we'll draw to your attention some of the scores where there was a much higher cognitive dissonance. The other thing to say is that we've based this survey around 6 dimensions. We've worked with a very large thought leadership group to look at the things that we wanted to examine. So we obviously wanted to ask about an approach. We wanted to ask about adoption. We then worked back and went, well, okay, are we aligning our changes to what we should be doing? And then we started to look at things like, have we got the capability to match our ambition? Have we got the agility to match our ambition? And because change is such a demanding thing that we ask of each other, have we got resilience in place to be able to do it? So these are the things that I'm going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so. If I'm not making sense, let me know. Put your questions in the chat, and Jill will sort of interrupt me and ask me as we go. So let's have a look at some of the key results. These are the things that we felt were being championed, certainly by the score. So the highest scores, and actually the highest score is much higher than it was last year. The highest score we had last year for anything was 73%. Here we've got 85% saying that skills for change management are known and they are respected. I'm going to challenge that figure in a little while from some of the other evidence, by the way. Changes are prioritised in my organisation, and each change builds on the previous change. I found those very interesting. You'll see that there is a little bit more around portfolio management and prioritisation that looks like it's certainly an improvement on last year, which is good to see. Because I think we all know that the volume of change is very high. And we think it's going to keep increasing, or over 80% of us think it's going to keep increasing. So you can't be effective in change unless you have some kind of portfolio management approach. It doesn't mean that you have to set up a portfolio office, but you have to have some understanding of the sheer volume of change that you're implementing. It also would be good to see, if we've got a very high volume of change, that we are thinking through a cohesive picture and that one change builds upon another. because otherwise, why have we made the first change if the second change doesn't then build on that? Why do we keep going off at tangents? So that is something that if we want to cope with an ever increasing volume of change, those two areas need to be positive. And it's good to see that there's a general feeling that those are definitely improving. A couple of areas we needed to fix though. And again, this was low last year and it's low again this year, that we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We don't review the effectiveness of change activities. Well, how can we be a professional body if we're not, actually improving how we do things? We claim to be a profession, we claim to be a respected management discipline, but if we're not then sort of thinking, well, that didn't work, how can we do it better? Then that continuous improvement being lacking, I think is unfortunate and something that we could easily fix. The one that we can't easily fix is our level of change is manageable. And I think we sometimes talk about change fatigue. But I was at a dinner with a portfolio officer recently who used the phrase change saturation. And I think that is so much more useful when we're talking about the volume, the level of change, because fatigue implies that people have allowed themselves to get tired. Saturation implies that perhaps the organization is saturating them and that therefore it is an organization issue. It is not an individual failure. So 1 in 5 of us think that our level of change is manageable. So that's not a helpful figure. One that you'll see has fallen, and again, I think there's something here about efficiencies, reorganization, and the focus of our organizations. Is that senior leaders just are not aligned to what they're asking staff to do. So leaders are not role modeling the changes is an issue. Some of the highlights that were the areas that were most improved, of course, because we're saying it's 85%, there's a significant upswing in change management is known and respected. It would be great if I mean, certainly it's obviously heading in the right direction, but it seems an excessively large number in terms of growth. It's good to see that those who struggle to change are feeling more supported. We'll have to look at that one. And changes being prioritized. That's a really helpful thing to see that we're improving on that. But the deterioration in leaders' role modeling changes, a belief that managing change is important, and the fact that we are not reviewing the effectiveness of our change activities is clearly of concern. But I think we can get more out of this if we look at the individual dimensions in a bit more detail. So as far as my organisation believes managing change is important, what we've got there is we've got a very high sort of think score. So perhaps the mechanisms, the tools are in place, but we don't feel that they're being used, they're being noticed, perhaps. It might be a nice idea at this point here to sort of have a look at what is it that we have got in place in terms of how we're looking at change. The things that sort of jump out at me at this point are, we know that change management is a skill, so there's a view there that's very, very high. We've got tools, and that's great, but the score for we train people in change management is lower than the fact that we've got tools, and we've got a framework. But again, the fact that we train people in change management is lower than we've got a framework. So maybe we need to sort of align those things a little bit better. And we have a central change management office. But what we keep hearing is that central change management office is the owner of the framework or approach. It's the owner of the tools, but certainly cannot keep up with the volume of change. So there is an expectation that change will be picked up and run with managers and staff within the organisation. And so it would be good to see we train people in change management being even higher. Probably not a surprise. Certainly it's not a surprise for all the heads of change management that I meet around the world. It's not country specific. That the person responsible for change management is not a board member. And in fact, in the majority of cases, nor do they report into a board member. So when it comes to the fact that change is the linchpin between investing in something and getting the realization from that investment, there's something definitely not right there. in that actually what we do helps organisations manage their risk, operational risk, staff risk in terms of staff leaving, customer risk in terms of utter chaos that the customers experience when we change things. And yet, when it comes to it, we're sort of pretty low down the pecking order, I think is something that I would particularly notice. I'll just go back here. As I've said, we review the effectiveness of change activities. The think score is so much higher than the implicit how we feel about it score. So I think within that approach, within those tools, yes, we do have some processes for retrospectives and lessons learned, but maybe we're not doing anything with it. Maybe we're not applying those every time we run a change activity. What's interesting about that is that that question was on a par last year. It was 51%, 53% last year. It's still about 50% on the think score, but the view, no, we're just not reviewing the effectiveness. That's absolutely plunged. So I think that's interesting. What we are seeing is an increase on the feel score, though, is that the activities to manage change are known. So there is a general feeling that perhaps we're getting our message out there, that we're trying to explain more clearly with each year that passes what is involved in behaviour change, which is a helpful thing. The more change there is, the more we need to get our argument out there. When it comes, so if we have a look at this next one here, we're having a look at capability. And in fact, we did add a couple of extra questions here for capability, a few things that I want to take us through. We added them because we got such feedback from you about you wanted to see more on this subject. So there's a couple of things I'm going to add in. Senior leaders being held accountable, the second one down there, has fallen. That feeling that it's actually dropped 24% on how we feel leaders or senior leaders are involved in what it is we're up to. And that will also see in terms of we've had a look at role modeling from senior leaders, and senior leaders knowing what it is that's needed for managing change are also much lower this year. So there is something, and we followed up on this. We have conversations with people, and there is a general feeling, I think, that the prevailing environment, which does have an effect on our implicit scores when we answer these kinds of surveys, the prevailing environment has tightened. The prevailing environment is no longer about how are you feeling, how's your workload, let me look after you. Let's bring your whole selves to work, which was an emphasis that we had throughout COVID, which was we were concerned about staff welfare. And actually that carried on. So if you think about it, we didn't really sort of escape COVID till the latter part of 2021, and that prevailing view that we want to look after each other, get to know each other and care about each other was certainly something that carried on into 2022. But what we're seeing here is that perhaps there is a tightening in terms of emphasis is on efficiency and productivity and not how people are feeling. And I think that's certainly the feedback we've been given, and the scores are certainly starting to indicate that. Jill, I know that you've talked to me about that several times. Is there any comment that you would like to add on that sort of prevailing picture that we're getting when you have conversations with people?
I don't think there is. I'm just trying to kind of thinking about these. So I don't think there's anything particularly that's jumping out there that I can add to that. What I was thinking while we're going through it, I would be really interesting when I get to do some more analysis, because when I do some more analysis for the next report, I'm going to be looking at breaking these down by people's roles or numbers in the organisation. So I think that will give us a slightly different picture. So it'd be really interesting to get into the more detailed piece.
Yeah, when we go through more detailed work in, we'll do another webinar in January. It's always interesting to see out of these highlights, and the highlights give us an indication of some of the things that we want to further investigate, which we've started with conversations already. I think that what I'll just talk about for a moment is, just go back to it, right down the bottom.
While you're there, we have got a question on that last one from
yeah.
Edwina. The shift back to productivity and efficiency is consistent with what we've seen in the last 6 months. So there's kind of Edwina's questioning that bit about productivity and efficiency. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that.
Ed, do you want to come off mute and just give us a bit more of around your question?
So really, it wasn't a question. I was just agreeing with exactly what you're saying, which is we've seen the shift away, a little bit away from the empathy piece and into efficiency, productivity. Everyone is trying to just survive in a hard financial environment. So it's very consistent, and we're seeing you're seeing it come through as well. So I think
it's really interesting, isn't it, that the management time is being directed to, are you getting stuff done? Are you getting stuff done? And yeah, we're going to see that again in another of the ones in a moment.
And Margarita asked, was this survey only completed by change practitioners?
Yes, you had to be involved in change. It was an invitation only survey. We talked to a number of people because we change practitioners, it might not be the change job title. It will be people who had a responsibility for change and therefore would understand these questions because they know about change. So yeah, this is why we don't keep it. We're not looking for huge numbers of tens of thousands of people filling it in. What we're looking for is people from our world to tell us how they think our world is doing, to be fair.
We also aim it at the very senior jobs, as senior as possible in the organisation. So it's not somebody just filling out an impact assessment. It's those who've got that strategic change piece. So heads of change, heads of organisation development, those kind of roles.
Yeah, people who are concerned about, well, are we able to manage change in our organisation, to be fair, because we're asking capability type questions. I think it's interesting that skills for change management are known and respected. Down the bottom there's a and that was high last year as well, and I think that goes to the membership of this survey question as well, because you can't help but answer positively when it is your job, but when you think about it in terms of the organization, the scores are much lower because you're thinking, yeah, but actually it's maybe it's not in everybody's job title, job description. It's not, there aren't specific activities that lots of people have to fill in, so there's a recognition that perhaps it's a bit lower. Some of the barriers to effective change, I thought it's worth sort of having a look here, because the top area is that change management activities are not understood. So although that we think down there that skills for change management are known and respected, less than half of us think that's happening. And we are then recognizing it as a top barrier. That now there are a couple of other barriers in there that are aligned to that. If change management activities are not understood, they're certainly not going to be valued. You can't value something that you don't understand. So every time we do this, I look at this and think, we have still, as a profession, we have still got so far to go in winning the argument. What is it that we do, and why is that useful? And we're still coming up with these issues. I think there are a couple of points, and this comes back again to this efficiency argument and the emphasis, the prevailing conditions we're seeing is insufficient resource availability. I'm sure we're all in the same boat. We've never felt busier ourselves, have we? But more to the point, the people around us. I feel guilty whenever I ask somebody to do something, because I know already they start from a position of being overwhelmed. That seems to be the prevailing condition across the piece. You don't meet anybody who's got lots of time to do things, and you do recognize that when you're asking them to take some involvement in a particular change, that you're probably knocking into their discretionary time. And that either you're probably asking them to stay late or get in early, when certainly they can't give up a lunch break because they never had one in the first place. You know, so I do feel that insufficient resource availability is there. And as we said from the earlier stat, only 1 in 5 of us think that our change level is manageable. 80% think that the level of change across the board is not manageable. But again, something else we're seeing as a major barrier is insufficient leadership involvement. So we've already seen that we don't think that senior leaders are getting involved enough. They don't really understand what's involved. And we're seeing here that the involvement is quite low. So again, and I find this useful because we tried to make sure that there were questions that basically backed each other up, or if one was higher and the others conflicted with that it was something that we could pursue. But we're certainly seeing that pattern coming through. We put these 2 extra questions in on capability. We have sufficient people to manage the volume of change. Well, no, we don't. And that feeling is stronger than the thinking, but there is that concern we don't have sufficient people. And what's interesting though is we must rely on help from external parties to manage the change. Do we feel that that's true? No, we don't feel that, although we think we probably ought to. And having conversations with a few people when I queried that, there was a feeling that, you know, we don't want to bring in external parties because we fall into the trap of doing change to people because we've outsourced it to a set of consultants, and therefore they'll structure it, they'll decide what has to change, and there's no internal ownership. But because we're so resource light at the moment, there is we're certainly going out and commissioning, buying in other people to do things for us. So is that there is a sort of concern there that this resource issue that we've got, we're going the wrong way. Instead of building the capabilities internally, we're going outside the organisation and bringing people in, and maybe we shouldn't be.
And I would put a slightly different slant on that, Mel. What I'm seeing in some organisations is they build change management capability in some kind of really talented people they see coming up through the organisation. Those people then go off to do another BAU job, business as usual type job. And then when the next project comes along, that resource can't be made available. So they then end up bringing external third parties to support the project. So I see a lot of that happening.
There's certainly, I think, a general panic, isn't there, around resourcing that we haven't. Again, it comes back to there's a core here. If you don't understand what the activities are for change management, you can't properly size them. If you can't properly size them, you can't properly resource them. So that's certainly an issue that we should be thinking about. I went back to this one for one more because we developed change management skills in our people. We're saying about half of us do. That has actually risen a little bit from last year, where we said that we felt we developed change management skills in our people at about 39%. So it's gone up 15% this year. That's great. Let's celebrate that. But clearly it's not going to be high enough for our concern over the fact we haven't got enough people. And we'll have a look at what that means for senior leaders in a moment as well. Here we're talking about ultimately we're trying to think about how do we get things adopted into, it's all very well having change, but you know, what is it that we're actually doing with the change? As far as the things that caught my attention, again, less than half of us believe our people understand what's involved in behaviour change. So it just comes back to that point. Hang on. If people don't understand what's involved in behaviour change, then how can they possibly understand what change management activities are needed? So how can they value them? So we thought that was a helpful question. That was different to change management skills. It was, do people understand actually what's involved in behaviour change? So clearly not enough. Again, we have a low score for we always measure the benefits achieved from change. And that's an unfortunately low score, I think, because if we want to be a profession, then surely what we've got to be doing is measuring what we achieve. How can we get the respect if we can't lay claim to achievements? And all of the workshops I have run this year, when it comes to thinking about benefits, we keep coming up against the same intractable problem, it appears, which is that so many of the benefits that a really well-run change offers the organisation are around the intangibles of staff feeling perhaps more supported and more confident. So I spend a lot of my time in workshops helping to break down those intangibles into things that you could actually notice happening and therefore measure. So, for example, when we talk about, will staff feel more confident? Well, what happens when staff feel more confident? Well, you see them sort of getting on with things. You see earlier adoption of the changes for a start, but also you see inter-team coaching going on, because people, when you feel confident, you're able to help other people because you know that you know what you're doing. So now you can share some of that knowledge. So you can play a game. I'm certainly not going to do some of that work here, but you can play a game which takes some of those intangibles, though, that good news story, and starts to take them into far more tangible measures. And I think for those of us interested in sort of getting that respect and getting that awareness of change management in our organizations, this is an area that we could really benefit from spending time on. How do we help people understand what we can offer the organization? And that the flip side of that is that we're saying that change management is a risk management activity. We are reducing operational risk. If we can get staff feeling that they are feeling supported, they are feeling confident, then we reduce the risk of churn, which reduces the risk that the organisation has to go out and do talent acquisition. So there is a lot of good stuff that we do, but perhaps we ought to be highlighting. Now, what's interesting for me is what I've ended up saying there is around what we offer the organisation is when staff feel supported, they feel confident in the new ways of working, it reduces churn and it reduces talent acquisition. Because a year ago and 2 years ago, when we were coming out the post-COVID world, we were talking much more about staff feeling supported, and that was a mental health benefit. A bit like Ed's already said this afternoon, actually, the conditions have tightened, and me making the argument about staff feeling better and feeling more supported, actually, in the boardrooms I work in, that's no longer getting the smiles and nods that it was getting. But when I talk about, will staff feel more engaged, feel more supported, feel more confident, so they don't leave, so you haven't got the talent acquisition cost, oh no, that's when they start to smile. So again, it's just, you know, it helps to bring some of that flavour in, because the boardrooms I sit in, you know, when you've hit on a good argument, and you know when you've also hit on an argument that just is not flying. It's just not on their radar at the moment. So yeah, again, conditions feel like they've tightened a little bit. In terms of we're talking about how we measure things, again, I'm encouraged by the fact that we are measuring people adopt the new ways of working, but I think we need to go further in terms of, it's great that we're doing that, but when I ask people, what are you measuring? They're actually measuring, well, they've logged onto the system. That's not adopting the new ways of working. That's not embedding the new processes as this is my new norm. And again, it's because it's really hard, because we're asking, has somebody made a mental shift from I used to do it this way to I now do it this way? So I think, again, I had somebody apologizing to me earlier this week she said, oh, I know these are very soft indicators, but in our organization, we do ask about how satisfied are you with your new ways of working? How confident are you with your new ways of working? And I thought, those are fantastic questions. And yet you're apologizing because you think they're a bit soft. So I took her through an exercise which went the other way and basically said, you can roll these up into quite hard indicators. And she went, that's brilliant. That's really useful. But so this organization, Swedish organization, they are doing it brilliantly, but actually doubted themselves. Certainly the organization is more productive, successful, is rating very, very highly, and that delivers the value set out in the business case. But it's all about how people adopt new ways of working. I think that is a key measure we ought to keep an eye on. When I see down the bottom, completed to time, completed to budget, that kind of makes me fearful that people are thinking about change much more as a project, a tangible change that we're implementing, rather than getting people persuaded to work in a different way and adopt new ways of working. But that's just a personal comment there. Right, let's have a look at the one that jumps out at me, because there's a theme here that's building up, is that leaders role model changes. Well, no, they don't. I think that seems to be the issue. It was much higher last year. There was the explicit score, right, has stayed the same. It was 47% last year, 46% this year. But last year, the how we feel about it was 71% feel that leaders role model the changes. It's dropped to a quarter. That's a massive drop. And yeah, do as I say, not as I do, is now becoming perhaps the I'm too busy to sort of try to role model and to explicitly show you how I'm also involved in the change. Just get on with it. Get on with it. It's your job. Just get it done. I've got other things to be worried about. Seems to be what we ought to be sort of concentrating on. There's a little bit of an upswing in people feel empowered to get things done. But the one that's really gone up here is we acknowledge and celebrate achievements. Again, the explicit score stayed the same. It was 64% last year, 63% this year, but it's gone from 21% to 50%. There's a feeling that perhaps we are sort of starting to acknowledge that, which is good. And also, the fact is that there's a feeling that perhaps we are supporting those who are struggling with change a little bit more, because the explicit score stays the same, but the implicit feeling has gone from 18% to 62%. So that's another massive drop. So there is an increase. So there is a real feeling that perhaps we are looking after how people feel. And after all, this is in the category of resilience. So I think that's a really important thing for us to look at, is thinking about how that actually resilience is the ability to keep going irrespective of what the pressures are. So kind of like the fact that we're putting a little bit of effort into this work.
And on this, Mel, one of the interesting things is when we look at those think scores, we see some slight movements, we see some trends. We don't see huge movements. We see the bigger movements in the feel. And I'm almost wondering with some of these feel scores, whether they're almost a leading indicator that the think scores are coming down. So when we looked at the leaders role modeling changes, we saw a slight drop from last year, but then we saw a big swing of change in the feel. And how you feel can be changed from day to day, what you're observing. So I did wonder, and it's just a thought, and it's not, I can't prove it, but I wonder if last year, as we were coming out of COVID, we saw people still showing those caring, concerned about people, and they're talking to people more. Now they're under pressure to get back to some kind of normality. Maybe they're pressured and they're not spending as much time talking to people. And then you'd observe less role modeling going on. And maybe that's having an effect, but that will longer term keep bringing that explicit think score down as well.
Interesting point. Yeah, I mean, this is what we never claim that and we never want you to sort of think that the survey gives us all the answers. It doesn't. We're in a complex world of emotional, psychological change here and how people feel, and which is why we ask about the feel as well as the think scores, to be fair. I'm aware that we're getting on, so I need to sort of pull out a few more things that I want to say. I think that my organisation anticipates and plans for change. Being sort of so low there, third one down, is of concern, in that the basics of anything should be we shouldn't surprise people. And it's disappointing because I think there should be a better link with the ones down the bottom. Changes are prioritised and my organisation effectively optimises its change portfolio. Because we are seeing from last year increases in both of those, which indicate that perhaps we are getting more of a grip on the totality of change that we're looking at. But we should then be partnering that with, surely if we are prioritizing changes, if we are optimizing our change portfolio, we should be able to tell people earlier in the cycle what changes are coming. So is it that we're not telling them, or is it that we just don't feel that message is getting through because frankly, everybody's so busy anyway? And it also goes to the figure at the top there, which again it's still really low when we look at the cumulative workload of multiple changes is tracked, because actually we feel less confident about this than we did last year. The implicit score has gone down, the explicit score has also gone down a little bit as well. So that's an area there that we might be prioritizing the changes better, deciding what we have to do first and what we can put on hold. And maybe that the emphasis has been on that because the volume is still very high. But we're still not doing the difficult bit. When Jill and I ran a symposium on impact assessment, and we've done it over the last few years, we've done a few of them, and they are hideous because so many people come not to share their experiences, but to basically say, we don't do any of this at all. Tell us how we could be doing it. How do we do an impact assessment, and how do we then knit that impact assessment together across lots of changes so we can see the total impact? It's one of the things that always sticks out in my mind in terms of how change management is being managed in organizations. There's a big gap there. I've just asked a global airline, what do you do about impact assessments? And the person who was heading up change sort of looked down at their paper, and I sort of said, do your change teams have a process for this? And they go, well, not really. And that's, I mean, that might make her feel bad, but also it doesn't. I've been talking to 3 airlines this week, actually, and they're all in the same boat. But it's not just airlines, it's every organization is struggling to do that. We're just not doing the very difficult bit, which is how do we roll it all up together? So there's something really missing on that one. Last one I'm going to quickly go on to is the alignment. The one that really captures my attention out of here is right down the bottom. Senior leaders know how to sponsor change. That's got lower than last year. It was 43-40 last year, 39-38 this year. The point is it hasn't gone up, has it? And I think it comes back to this point about we're seeing a decrease in senior leadership role modeling. We're seeing a decrease in senior leadership taking responsibility for change, and we're seeing a decrease in senior leaders knowing how to sponsor change. So we know that that is an area that perhaps we have to target, but that goes back to something we saw earlier on, which is heads of change management are not board members themselves, and they are not, more to the point, reporting to board members. So actually, often a lot of us are in an invidious position of trying to speak truth to power from a very disadvantageous position. So we're not, when it comes to training on senior leaders in change management, unfortunately, we're not training our peer group. We are absolutely having to train upwards. And that means that we have a lot less persuasive power when it comes to doing something quite so important. So I would argue that that's something that we as a profession need to think about. How do we make this something that others want to get involved in? My own experience is that when I am training sponsors, what I am not saying is that I'm training them in how to manage change. What I am talking to them about is training them in how to manage risk. And that gets a far higher hit rate in terms of level of interest than trying to talk about change. Change is always somebody else's responsibility. But when I start to talk about risk, and the other piece I can talk about is around return on investment, if I can roll it under those titles, I get far more interest. So something that maybe we ought to be thinking about.
So we do have questions as well, Mel.
Yeah, fire away.
We're using this term leader. So Martin's asked, can we, is the word term leader, is it a composite of manager and leader of a group of people, or traditional team manager? What do we mean by leader?
what we mean by leader, because we have to cut across all of the job titles, is somebody that is in that kind of position of authority within your organization, however you interpret that. Because you could argue that a senior manager is a leader in that they have authority over a change, but equally you could have a department head who's actually leading on change. So what we do is, if we just give it up to you, your interpretation, but leader is something that there's an implied authority there. So it's those that have that authority around change.
Like I saw Martin's thumb go up. Julia asks, do the variances in the scores from the last survey concern you? Could there be other reasons for variances? And what do you think needs to happen to bring those scores back up?
The variances did concern both Jill and I enough that we went back to the organisation, and we ended up with some very useful data back from them, to talking about the fact that when there are significant variances around how people feel, that it was something we had to bear in mind with the prevailing conditions, which has led us to have interesting conversations about, and this is what Ed, I think, was picking up towards the beginning of this webinar, the prevailing conditions have tightened. Economically they've tightened, but I think the emphasis going, although there is still a huge push for innovation and agility in organizations, but there is a big push for operational efficiency, reorganizing to get the most out of the available resources, and I'm certainly seeing that across all organizations. So we realized that perhaps where we're seeing some of the significant changes are on, you can look and think, actually perhaps the prevailing conditions are leading to that feeling that things are worse than they were before.
Yeah, and I think when you said at the start of that, we went back to the organisation, we went back to the people in Truth Sayers who ran the survey for us. We went back to their people who specialise in understanding cognitive dissonance, and we wanted to just test with them, were we right in our thinking that something was happening here, and if so, what would cause it? And they came up with a lot of the things that Mel's using today. I think the other part of the next question, I think it almost was an answer. Somebody said some senior managers expect change managers to have a silver bullet and be able to solve these problems in a jiffy. And that kind of resonated with me. I don't know about you, Mel.
Yeah, I mean, where there are change managers, it is almost as if we walk on water. A lot of us will probably say that we're brought in far too late to be able to have the impact that we think we could have anyway. And that concerns me, because it goes back to people not understanding what it is that we do. And therefore, we're not front and centre in their considerations when they're setting up an initiative. So they'll hand it over through the project management arm, but there won't necessarily be an automatic, and we should partner with change management. So when we are brought on, we are expected to make miracles happen. I think that is one of the issues we all face, and that's only in organisations that do have change managers. There's still an awful lot of organisations that don't have any kind of formal change management.
Yep. And I think following on from that, Fiona's asked a few questions as we're going through. She's kind of thinking about this risk piece, but it makes her worry that we might sound more like project managers and change managers. And she's thinking in her organisation about offering some leadership coaching.
Yeah, certainly the word coaching is, I think, is always a sales word these days. But I do find in some organisations, change is just not the word that gets people's support. If risk is unhelpful, then it could be that you use it under the guise of benefits, and say, actually, because what we do is, and we go back all the way to the first diagram when I showed, what we're doing is we're realising benefits for the organisation. I'm going to put it on the last slide because I know that a number of you are going to have to leave now for your next meetings. But I think the key thing is we'll make this available to you. Share this recording with your colleagues, reflect on the results, and identify any factors there that really resonate with you, that you think, actually, that's much more relevant to our situation. Call out a few of those. And run it as a change, create that collaborative task force, create an action plan, and start addressing that one area. that I think there's a number of factors. Some of it might be sponsor training. Some of it might be around prioritization and the totality of impact. Some of it might be building capability within your own organization for others, not just change professionals to be able to cope with change, but doing something, picking out some theme and going, do you know what, over the next year, it's not unreasonable that we could actually address this. So have a think about using some of these points with your own change agent networks to actually go, well, out of all of this, what really resonates with us? What would we like to focus on? Because I think that is a very helpful part of your action planning. Thank you very much for this. I'm going to stop the recording now.